Welcome back to part 2 of the Rules of the Road review from Chesapeake Marine Training. This second portion, we're going to start with Rule 11, and we're going to go through Rule 19, and we're going to get into a little bit more of the definitions and how vessels act with one another when they encounter each other at sea. So the very first thing we're going to turn to is page 22 and 23 in your Navigation Rules Handbook. And section 2 deals with conduct of vessels in sight of one another. Now, if you remember back to the first portion of this review, you remember that in sight of means that you observe them visually. So typically that means that you see them with your eyes or maybe with the aid of a binocular, but you see them. So Rule 11 just states that we're in sight. So all of the things we're going to talk about next, you need to be in sight of the other vessel for it to apply. So Rule 12, we're going to talk about sailing vessels. Now, a lot of people don't, that come through our school don't deal a lot with sailing vessels. So this is one of the trickier ones. If you're a sailing person that has some experience on sailing vessels, this is probably pretty easy for you. But for those of us that have been mostly on power-driven vessels, this one's a little tricky. And there are 3 scenarios that they discuss when 2 sailing vessels encounter each other. So this is only 2 sailing vessels. This does not involve power-driven vessels or fishing or not under command or any of those. This is just 2 sailing vessels. So Rule 12 says sailing vessels. A, when 2 sailing vessels are approaching one another so as to involve a risk of collision, one of them will keep out of the way of the other as follows. So what they're going to outline here are 3 different scenarios, and I've put them up on the board here. First scenario is right here, letter I. Second scenario, I. And third scenario, I. All right, so let's look at the first one. It says that when each has the wind on a different side, the vessel which has the wind on her port side shall keep out of the way of the other. Okay, so I have annotated the wind here. So in this scenario, the wind is coming from that direction. And when you look at the 2 vessels here, this black line would indicate the way that the sail is being blown. Okay, so letter I stated that when each has the wind on a different side, the one that has the wind to port will keep out of the way. So if we're looking at these, vessel B here has the wind on her port side. Vessel C has the wind on her starboard side. So because vessel B has the wind on her port side, vessel B has to get out of the way. All right, so this is the give way vessel, which we will talk about a little bit more later. Okay, that's the first scenario. So those 2 vessels have the wind on different sides. The one with the port side wind has to give way. Now, second scenario, okay? When both have the wind on the same side, the vessel which is to windward shall keep out of the way of the vessel which is to leeward. So if you're not familiar with those terms, a simple way to put it is whichever vessel is closer to the wind is considered the windward vessel. And if you're kind of on the back side of the wind or being hidden by that other vessel, your vessel is to leeward. So in this scenario, number 2, both vessels have the wind to her port side, coming like this, okay? Vessel H here is closer to the wind, okay? So she is the windward vessel. Vessel F here is the leeward vessel. Because vessel H is closer to the wind, she is the give way vessel. And the idea is that if you're filling up your sails with the wind, this vessel may not get so much wind, so her sails might be a little less full and she would be less maneuverable. And so this vessel could overtake the other or steal the wind from the other. There's a bunch of different reasons, but this vessel would have to stay out of the way of this vessel. Okay, they have the wind on the same side. However, this one's to windward and this one's to leeward. And the last scenario is I. If a vessel with the wind on her port side sees a vessel to windward and cannot determine with certainty whether the other vessel has the wind on her port or starboard side, she shall keep out of the way. So in this scenario here, we have a sailing vessel with the wind on her port side, as indicated here. And we look over a little bit different kind of sailing vessel, maybe a bigger one, and we can't really tell where she has the wind. It's somewhere in this area, right? So because we don't know if it's on the port or starboard side, maybe it's up or stern, I know that I have the wind on my port side, so I would give way to that vessel. Okay, so this vessel again is the give way. So if you can kind of just remember that any vessel that is the closest to the wind and has it on her port side, that's going to be the give way vessel. Okay, that's kind of the easiest way to remember that. And that's really all you need to know about sailing vessels. Those three rules. Wind on opposite sides, port side gives way. Wind on the same side, windward vessel gives way. Wind, when you know it and you're unsure, you give way. All right. Now, moving on to rule 13, 14, and 15. Now, these kind of go together. Okay. So we're going to talk about them all kind of in one shot. So rule 13 is called overtaking, and an overtaking vessel is defined on page 24, and it says that notwithstanding anything contained in rules of Part B, Section 1 and 2, any vessel overtaking another shall keep out of the way of the vessel being overtaken. So in this scenario here, we're here, Rule 13, overtaking. If I have a vessel that is coming up the stern of another vessel, this is the overtaking vessel, this is the overtaken vessel, this vessel will stay out of the way. Now, obviously, this vessel has to be making a greater speed than this one. So, it would be obvious that they would be overtaking, but this vessel would have to stay out of the way of that vessel and make a nice, safe pass as they go by that vessel. It also says that a vessel shall be deemed to be overtaking when coming up with another vessel from a direction more than 22.5 degrees abaft the beam. So when we talk about abaft the beam, if you think about the vessel's beam being here, they mean that you would be coming up more than 22.5 degrees abaft the beam. And that's easy to tell because once we cover the lights configuration, you would only be seeing the other vessel's stern light. So you can always tell if you're in an overtaking situation with another vessel if you see their stern light. And that's exactly what they say later on. It says that in such a position with reference to the vessel she is overtaking, that at night she would only be able to see the stern light of the vessel, but neither side lights. And letter C, when a vessel is in any doubt as to whether she is overtaking another, she shall assume that this is the case and act accordingly. There are times when you might be right on the cusp of that 22.5 degrees abaft the beam statement. And so maybe it's daytime and you can't quite tell. Always assume that that is the case and stay out of that other vessel's way. And then D says, any subsequent alteration of the bearing between two vessels shall not make the overtaking vessel a crossing vessel within the meaning of these rules, or relieve her of her duty to keep clear of the overtaken vessel until she is finally passing clear. What they mean there is, let's say you start overtaking this vessel. Well, then you get up here and you're like, oh, I see her side light. So now I'm a crossing situation. Well, that's not true. Once you're overtaking another vessel, you remain an overtaking vessel until you're passed and clear and kind of reset the situation. All right, the next one is a head-on situation. Okay, this one's pretty obvious, right? Head-on is when two power-driven vessels, now this is a little different. So this was just, vessels, okay? This only involves power-driven vessels. So this does not include sailing, fishing, nuck, ram, and so on. There's a different rule for that. This involves two power-driven vessels only. It says that they are meeting on reciprocal or nearly reciprocal courses so as to involve a risk of collision. Each shall alter her course to starboard so that each shall pass on the port side of the other. Now, one thing to remember is that reciprocal means opposite. Okay, so generally if you're on opposite courses, now it doesn't have to be exactly like 180, 000. There's a couple, 2 degrees or so where you can see across the bow as the vessel moves up and down. So it doesn't have to be exact, but generally when you're heading towards each other, that is considered a head-on, and it involves 2 power-driven vessels. And what they want each vessel to do is alter her course to starboard for a port-to-port passage. That's the common method of doing that. It says such a situation shall be deemed to exist when a vessel sees the other ahead or nearly ahead, and by night she could see the masthead lights of the other in line or nearly in line, and or both side lights, and by day she observes the corresponding aspect. So if you're looking at a power-driven vessel that's lengthy, you're going to see 2 masthead lights in line as well as both of their side lights in a head-on situation. And it says, when any vessel is in any doubt as to whether this situation exists, she shall assume that it does and act accordingly. So if you're not sure, go ahead and come right and open up that situation to something a little bit safer. Now, the next rule is Rule 15 on the next page, page 26 and 27. And it says that when 2 power-driven vessels, so once again, we are only talking about power-driven vessels. We're not talking about any of the other vessels that we defined back in Rule 3. We are talking about 2 power-driven vessels that are crossing so as to involve a risk of collision. The vessel which has the other on her own starboard side shall keep out of the way and, if circumstances of the case admit, avoid crossing ahead of the other vessel. So this is pretty obvious. We've got this vessel here, and anywhere in this area, anywhere like this would be considered a crossing. Same as over here. If I'm coming up here, anywhere like around this area, this is considered crossing. So pretty much if it's not an overtaking and it's not a head-on, it's a crossing situation. And the vessel that is to the right has right of way. That's an easy way to remember that. The vessel which is to the right has the right of way. And that's kind of easy because if you're looking at night, you would see the green side light of that other vessel, and typically green means go, to a point. We'll talk about that next. But yeah, this vessel here would be obliged to just continue on, and this vessel typically would come to the right and go behind that vessel, okay? Like I mentioned before, a lot of times accidents happen because vessels decide to speed up and cross the head of cross the bow of another vessel, and that's usually when some bad situations happen. So we don't want that. So it's always a little bit safer just to come behind the vessel. Okay, that's Rule 15. So we talked about a overtaking, which was where you're coming up from behind someone. We talked about head-on, where you are both on reciprocal courses. And we talked about crossing. Now, in this situation, you're going to have a stand-on and give-way vessel. So I'll just use this one because it's within view, okay? In a head-on situation, neither vessel are the stand-on or the give-way because both vessels are required to give way and turn to starboard. So let's use this example, okay? In a crossing situation, we're going to have what's called a give-way vessel and a stand-on vessel. So that's Rule 16 and Rule 17 on page 26 and 27. So action by the give-way vessel states, every vessel which is directed to keep out of the way of the other vessel shall, so far as possible, take early and substantial action to keep well clear. So what they're saying is that if you are required to get out of the way, like this one, take early and substantial action. They don't tell you what to do, but they tell you you need to do something. It needs to be big and it needs to be early, okay? Now for stand-on vessel, it gets a little bit more detail, and you think, wow, I'm the stand-on vessel, I should just be able to keep going, not worry about what's going on. Well, that's not true, because in the beginning, if you remember, I told you, you cannot use the rules as a defense. So if you hit someone, you can't say, well, I was a stand-on vessel and I'm required to keep my course and speed. Well, that's true to a point, which is why I wrote what I wrote on the board. The stand-on vessel actually has kind of 3 phases of action, and this could be over 30 seconds or it could be over 3 hours. So it just depends on the situation at hand. So the stand-on vessel, Rule 17 says, when one of 2 vessels is to keep out of the way of the other shall keep her course and speed. So the first step is maintain your course and speed. Continue what you were doing. give the other vessel time to make a decision on what they're going to do, and then they can take action. But let's say some time has gone by and they haven't done anything and you're starting to get nervous. It says the latter vessel may, so you may take action to avoid collision by her maneuver alone as soon as it becomes apparent to her that the vessel required to keep out of the way is not taking appropriate action in compliance with the rules. So if I'm watching this other vessel expecting them to do something but they don't, I can go ahead and take action. The rules do allow me to do that. It says I may. If I feel I should, I can. Now, the third phase of this is letter B. It says, when from any cause the vessel required to keep her course and speed finds herself so close that collision cannot be avoided by the action of the give-way vessel alone, she shall take such action as will best aid to avoid collision. So what they're saying here is there is a point where the other vessel, no matter what they do, speed up, slow down, hard turn, whatever it is, you're still going to have a collision. You are required at this point to take action because it says you shall. And essentially what they're trying to get you to do at that point is to help the maybe a T-bone turn into a glancing blow or something that's a little less impactful so that we have less damage and less chance of loss of life. So when we talk about stand on, first, maintain your course and speed. But second, if you feel the need, go ahead and change course or speed. And if you know that no matter what that other vessel does, because they're so close or you've been calling them up for an hour and they haven't answered, you will take action. You shall do it. You have to. Okay, you can't just say, I was the stand-on vessel and they should have got out of my way. Well, that's true, but you don't have right of way through another vessel, and that's very important to understand. So when you see a test question that talks about being in extremis, that means that you are now in the jaws of collision and you're definitely going to hit someone. You are required to take some action to help that situation in the best way that you can. All right, so the stand-on vessel does have a little bit more responsibility, it seems, when the situation gets a little tricky. Now, that is Rule 17. We're going to do Rule 18, which I put a little ladder up here to discuss. Now, it's written a little bit different in the book than how we kind of talk about it. Remember, this is for vessels inside of one another, okay? And it says except Rules 9, 10, and 13. So 9 and 10 was the narrow channel and traffic separation scheme. So if the test question says something like you're in a narrow channel or you're in a traffic separation scheme, then that rule applies. But if it doesn't say that, this rule applies. This is just think open water, okay? This is open water that's not a narrow channel or a fairway or a traffic separation scheme. So 13 is also the overtaking rule, which we kind of put it into our ladder here. That's kind of how we teach it. So a vessel that's being overtaken, whether it's by someone that's broke down or working or power driven or a seaplane, whatever, they're at the very top, okay? That vessel doesn't have to get out of the way of anyone because you're overtaking them. They just keep doing what they're doing and you go around them, okay? Now, how we remember it, the way that we remember it is we have a kind of a memory aid, a saying, so to speak, and we say, only new reels catch fish, so purchase some worms. Only new reels catch fish, so purchase some worms. Now, the reason that we do that is because it's a fairly easy memory aid, and the first letter of only new reels catch fish, so purchase some worms, is the first letter of the type of vessel that's going to appear in our ladder here, our hierarchy. This is the ladder of who has to get out of the way of who. If you're higher up on the ladder, you're more, there's less vessels you have to get out of the way of. If you're down at the bottom of the ladder, you're going to have to get out of the way of more vessels. So the O stands for overtaken, right? If someone's overtaking you, you don't have to do anything. If you are not under command, remember, that is essentially broke down. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't move at all, but that just means that you're broke down in some kind of way, okay? REALS stands for restricted inability to maneuver. And if you remember back last lesson, that deals with work. So that is work related. So I am laying cable, or I am tending to a buoy, maybe I'm the Coast Guard, or I'm landing a plane, or I'm doing some underway replenishment. The next one is constrained by draft, and remember that was depth related, so a larger vessel that's constrained by draft. And remember, this was international only. That does not apply in inland waters. That is international only. The next type of vessel is fishing, and remember that is nets, lines, and trawls. Okay. Sailing, if we remember, was under sail alone. Power driven means that we are using propulsion, right? Just kind of reviewing those terms. And then seaplane and wing and ground craft. Seaplane and wing and ground craft. So if I'm looking at this list and I have a test question that states, you are on board a power driven vessel, which of the following vessels must you stay out of the way of? And they list a fishing vessel, a seaplane, a wing and ground craft, or none of the above. Well, I'm on a power-driven vessel. There's a fish in there, there's a seaplane, and there's a wing and ground craft. Anything above me, I must get out of the way of. So if the choice appears above you on the ladder or in the hierarchy, you have to get out of the way of them. If they are below you, they have to get out of your way. Now remember, this is only in sight of one another. So if the visibility goes bad and you have fog set in, this does not apply. Okay, this is only in sight of one another. So only new reels catch fish, so purchase some worms. Overtaken, not under command, restricted, constrained, fishing, sailing, power, seaplane, wing and ground craft. It's very important that you memorize that, because on a test there's typically 4 to 5 questions that just deal with this, or the narrow channel traffic separation scheme, understanding who do you have to get out of the way of and in what situation would that happen. All right, so the last rule here is Rule 19. Conduct of vessels in restricted visibility. So that means through some sort of natural event, you have fog, or one time I was in an area where there was a volcano erupted, so there was a lot of ash in the air, and so that created a restricted visibility situation. There's lots of different ones that could happen, but this rule applies to vessels not inside of one another, navigating in or near an area of restricted visibility. That means that you could be in the fog bank or you could be near it. This applies to you as well, because if you're near the fog, we want to also let people know, hey, I'm right outside of that fog bank. In case you pop out and see me, you're not as alarmed. B, every vessel shall proceed at a safe speed adapted to the prevailing circumstances and conditions of restricted visibility. A power-driven vessel shall have her engines ready for immediate maneuver. Now, what that means is if you are on a vessel that has more than one engine, but you don't have it online and ready to go, you would have to bring that engine online and be ready to answer anything forward or reverse that you would need to get out of a collision situation. So if you go in the fog, you got to turn all your engines on. The next one, every vessel shall have due regard to the prevailing circumstances and conditions of restricted visibility when applying the rules 4 through 10. And D says, a vessel which detects by radar alone the presence of another vessel shall determine if a close quarter situation is developing or a risk of collision exists. Now here's where the test question comes in, and it's kind of tricky, so you make sure you read this. So it says, if so, she shall take avoiding action in ample time, provided that when such action consists of an alteration of course, the following shall be avoided. So this is what you do not want to do. 1, an alteration of course to port for a vessel forward of the beam, other than for a vessel being overtaken. So if I see a vessel on radar, because remember, I'm not in sight, I see a vessel on radar, so it's just a pip, I do not want to turn to port for a target that's forward of my beam, because the chances of them coming towards my direction are pretty high, and so I would be cutting across their bow, so we don't want to do that. An alteration of course towards a vessel abeam or abaft the beam. So let's say I see a vessel on radar that's on my starboard quarter on my radar scope. Well, I don't want to come to starboard, because if that vessel is coming in the same direction that I'm traveling, I would cut across their bow and could have a collision. So the main thing to remember is that we are only detecting these vessels by radar, so we don't see them. So we don't want to start taking action with an unknown vessel that might be close to us and then result in a collision. Okay. And then E says, except where it's been determined that a risk of collision does not exist, every vessel which hears apparently forward of her beam the fog signal of another vessel, or which cannot avoid a close quarters situation with another vessel forward of her beam, shall reduce her speed to the minimum at which she can be kept on course. She shall, if necessary, take all way off, and in any event, navigate with extreme caution until danger of collision is over. So what they talk about there is coming to bare steerage way. That's a term that you'll see in the industry, but also on these tests. What they're telling you that if you hear a fog signal forward of your beam and you're not quite sure what's going on with that situation, slow to a speed where you can still maneuver the vessel very slightly to get out of the way if you see that vessel at the last minute. Bare steerage way could be clutch speed for you, or it could be a couple of knots for some of the bigger ships, but it's basically enough prop wash to be able to control the heading of that vessel if you do have a contact that shows up kind of last minute that you need to react to. Okay, so that is the conclusion of rules 11 through 19. We will pause here, and then if you're continuing on, look for the third video in this session of Rules of the Road, and we'll be back here shortly. Thank you.